All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. This is the last day, yay, that we're going to talk about Elbert Dempsey. And this is from Nadine. Nadine's online. Can you hear us at home?
I can.
Okay, good. That was not very loud.
Yeah, we can hear you. Say it
You
again.
want to talk again?
Hello.
Okay,
Oh, there you go.
we turned
There
it
you are.
Well, mine was down too.
Okay. So anyway, this is the last chapter of actually the second book that we've been, kind of bringing some of the restoration thought into our discussion of prophecy. And this is chapter 21 from The Power of the Prophetic, which was an earlier book by Elbert Dempsey, and it's called The Prophets to the Rescue. And so the purpose of this chapter is to kind of tie everything all together that we've been talking about, to summarize very briefly some of the historic steps that different prophets have taken us in the journey to a more complete understanding of God, I guess, if you will, or to I hope a better understanding of God. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Just depends on, the history that was associated with it. So anyway, let's get started. If I can change my screen here. Oh, there it is. And so I'll tell you my reasoning behind the picture here in just a second. Dempsey starts off in this chapter and he says the modern theological trend is to see a more pervasive God who is more bound up in the everyday affairs of life rather than the traditional views. And those are all of the other prophetic views of God that we have been discussing for quite a few weeks now. The mystical view, the magical view. I can't read that without thinking of a magical mystery tour. So that's my Beatles history going on there. But anyway, the apocalyptic view, the dispensationalism that we talked about, the ideas, this is also apocalyptic, satanic wars in heaven, wars of good versus evil. And then the priestly view, which is kind of more about the rules and regulations of religion. And the reason I put the picture up here from Fiddler on the Roof is because I absolutely love this character, Tevye, and the relationship that he had with God. That's the kind of relationship, I guess, sometimes that I, would aspire to have. And if you remember any parts of the movie where he's, dragging the wagon because his horse has gone lame, and he says, and he's talking to God the whole time, and he's kind of looking up at the sky as if there's a person up there. And he's just having this conversation about life. It's just about, of all the hardships that I've got, and then you make my horse go lame. And what is it? What do you got against me, God? And it's just so practical and so beautiful and so perfect. It's just like God is his partner in life, and he can have these discussions. And so I wanted to start off and say, yes, we're moving away from all of maybe some of the mysticism, and we'll talk about, whether that's good or not. Certainly probably good to be moving away from the magical thinking and some of the apocalyptic stuff, although many people still are impacted by that and embrace it. And that's fine. But I just wonder, how does Dempsey's statement here kind of square with your views about God and prophecies in light of all of the discussions that we've been having? Where I'm just curious where the class is, if you have thoughts about that. Has this course changed your perspective? Maybe that's a good question.
I think so, especially about what he considers prophecy is.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not for the distant future, and it's to take care of today's problems.
Yeah, so that's very Tevye-like, right? Because my problems are today. Let's talk about today. Okay. Anybody else?
Yes. What I appreciate about Dempsey's arguments is that, and scholarship, is he's able to show that what we call Christianity and Judaism is more heterogeneous. The tradition is more heterogeneous rather than being like one, what am I trying to say?
Homogeneous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying not to get too technical.
One faceted, like one facet as opposed to multifaceted. Is that a word that would work for you?
Yeah, he's showing the strands. Where I have misgivings again is why does his interpretation or his view of prophecy, why is that the best one?
Okay, I think that's a very fair question, and we're going to kind of get into that a little bit in this final chapter. I think hopefully this was mailed out. I think everybody had an email copy, and maybe some have had a chance to read it. But we're going to kind of get into some of that here in a few slides, Ryan. So, but I agree.
I didn't agree on everything. I mean, I don't think he's the best. I think he just wants us to think. In my mind, what he taught me was there are different ways of looking at prophecy.
Yeah.
So I need to think a little bit more than this is prophecy.
Well, and I think too, there was a movement in the church leadership back. This is, we're looking at 35 years ago when this was written, basically, and there was a movement to help expand our thinking a little bit about prophecy, or maybe reel it in. Maybe that's a better way to think about it. To what really is prophecy for, and how does it impact the church? And I can imagine these discussions going on at high levels back at that time. How do we have a rational, realistic view of prophecy, and a view that will allow us to continue to be a prophetic people without getting us outside of where we shouldn't be, if that makes sense. So I can see Dempsey's very academic. He's presenting this stuff in a scholarly way, and he's obviously thought a lot about it. And I think it kind of represents probably those discussions that were happening in the church back then, in some ways.
I think that's more the view of our church. In other words, a prophet generally tells things that are going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, or that not something's going to happen 1,000
Right.
years
Well,
from now.
that's we were struggling back then with prophecy. If you will remember, I'm back to almost the first week that we started this book. I think it was Coral that mentioned the multiple murders in Kirtland, Ohio, at the hands of Jeff Lundgren, who was my first cousin, by the way, if you didn't know that. So I knew Jeff very, very well. And on many levels, he was a very disturbed human being who thought he was a prophet. And going back to some of the early restoration views of prophecy and Joseph Smith, he combined that with his warped sense of what the world was, and a lot of bad experiences, I think, that he had growing up and in the military, and it created this really horrible person that he became. And this is about the time this is all being written. And I can hear these discussions going on at high levels and saying, this could lead the church in a bad way if we don't kind of fix this right now.
Drug another cousin in with him.
Yeah. And Jeff,
What'd you say,
believed
He
Jeff.
drug another one of his cousins in with him that I had grown up with
Yeah.
in my early days.
Yeah, and Jeff, believed he was a prophet, and he believed that he was very apocalyptic, and he believed that there were demons being released from the center of the earth, and that the demons were trying to lead us in the wrong direction. And he believed in his mind that he was the one who was going to fix all of this and lead us into the end times. He firmly believed that. I have no doubt in my mind. So this was a juncture for the church. And we were going through some very difficult times with that whole situation in Kirtland. Dale Leffman was the apostle out there at the time, and it was very tough on him to have to deal with all of this. So anyway,
What years would that have been? I don't know this
so
story.
he was, I think 1989 to 1990 was where the murders took place. And for a few years before he moved out to Kirtland with his wife and became, one of the people that worked for the church as a tour guide. Okay, some of you have done that. Ryan, have you done that? So he started out that way, and then as he got more bizarre, the apostle had to say, you can't work for us anymore. This is not what we represent. So he took his little group off and bought a farm, and he set up a situation there where he thought he was going to have Zion or whatever. I guess I'm not sure what it was. And then when the one family tried to leave, he killed them and buried them in the barn. And then they fled. And some months later, the police in that part of Ohio uncovered the bodies, and there was a big chase that caught Jeff and Alice out in California, I believe, and brought him back. And he's dead now. He was executed by the state of Ohio after 16 years on death row and in the prison in Ohio. So. But anyway, so, did that have something to do with why this book was written? Was this a call to the church to let's, get real on this? Dempsey also said that modern theology has largely discredited these other prophetic views of God. We can, agree or disagree with that, or whether it's a good thing or not, and then ask, are we headed in the right direction? We've had lots of those discussions in the course of looking at this book.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up what was kind of a grisly chapter in our history, but it reminds me that so much of I don't know, the history of a movement is shaped by reaction.
Yeah.
Reaction against, something that came before it. And so I think there is a need to safeguard against the kind of that cult-like tendencies or magical thinking or something that you do go off the deep end.
Yeah. Well, and I think in our attempts to distance ourselves from all of that, we can't totally forget it. We have to embrace it as part of the history of this movement. That's a very unpleasant part, but we don't ever want to go down that road again. So it's very real.
Was he against the prophecy of women in the priesthood? Did that kind of start him off? Because it seems interesting timing wise.
Yeah, I don't know.
Dempsey's books were written in 88 and 93,
Yeah.
so that was definitely in reaction to the women in the priesthood prophecy.
Yeah.
Shook
I don't.
the earth.
I mean, I don't. I wish my parents were still around. Especially my mother, she, was very close to Jeff and Alice before all of this, before they went out to Kirtland, and knew them pretty well. Whether or not he had disagreements about that, I really don't know.
I'd like to ask Dempsey what his motivation was, because it is interesting.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna. I have a couple of things here. If you're just curious as to what people believe in the United States, this is the Pew Research Center. This is a group, an organization that sends out surveys and sort of has their pulse on what the attitudes and beliefs and so forth of the nation are. And so this was a 2017 study that was called "What Americans Say They Believe in God and What Do They Mean?" And so these are percentages. This first slide here is the percent of people who believe that God determines what happens to them. And I guess this would get into the whole discussion of predestination and versus free will. Not that I want to open up that rabbit hole today, but it's interesting that 27% of the people in 2017 in this country believe that God determined what happened to them all the time, and 21% most of the time. So that's 48%. So that's almost half of the population. And then you add in another 18%, I believe some of the time. So there's a significant number of Americans in 2017 whose perception about God, which is what we've been discussing with the idea of prophecy, is that God is very involved in, day-to-day life. Maybe these are kind of the tevias that, we're talking to God. God is real. God is, leading us. And then we have 9% who say hardly ever, 13% who say never, don't know as 1%, and then 10% who don't believe in God. So those are atheists. Okay. This is percentage of who believe that God has protected them. 77% would acknowledge feeling a protective power from God. 67% acknowledged that they believed that God had rewarded them at some point in their life. 61% believe in judgment, that God will judge all people on what they've done. 40%, which I thought was interesting, believe that God has punished them.
Has punished.
That's, yeah.
It'd be really interesting after the pandemic to see these numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that has punished them would be.
Maybe even
Higher.
higher. Yeah, hard to say.
Huh.
I'm not just presenting this to kind of give you a cross section of what we think here in the United States. This is a percentage who believe that they talk to God and God talks to them, 28%. They talk to God, God does not talk to them, that's 47%. So the discussion is one way. They do not talk to God and God talks to them, that's less than 1%, or no, that's don't know, I'm sorry. They do not talk to God because God does not talk to them, 15%, and then 10% are atheists. So again, that sort of is just a snapshot of the various relationships that people perceive that they have with the Creator. All right, we're going to leave that and we're going to get philosophical here for a little bit. Because when we talk about the reasons why Dempsey wrote this book in the time that he did, and trying to help the church come to a new understanding about what the prophetic method is and what prophecy does for us and what prophecy doesn't do for us. This gentleman, Paul Tillich, how many of you have heard of Paul Tillich? So very, very famous 20th century philosopher and theologian, and one who I know has impacted the thinking of our church's leadership. I've heard lots of discussions and classes where this name gets brought up, and it's like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. A lot of people highly respect the Christian beliefs of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so his name comes into the discussion often. Paul Tillich is very much the same way. So he was from Germany. He was a Christian philosopher and a theologian. He was a member of the Lutheran faith. He actually served as a chaplain in the German army in the trenches with the troops during World War I, was injured several times and suffered long-term, took a very long-term time for him to recover after the war. As Germany moved toward Nazism in the 1930s, he took his family and immigrated to the United States. By that time, he had some credentials. He'd been to seminary and came over here and taught in a number of prestigious seminaries and universities, including Harvard and University of Chicago were two that I remember in particular where he was at. So what did Tillich contribute to Dempsey's understanding about all of this? This is, bear with me. I'm going to try to explain it. It was a little hard to understand in the chapter, so I've done a little outside work here to try to bring this together. And Tillich was a philosopher who had a very big universal view about God. And he basically asked the question, is God too big to be, in the sense that we are all beings. We live, we breathe, we interact with each other, talk to each other. And he felt that perceiving God in that element maybe was limiting to the concepts that he had about God. And so he said that the ultimate concern of human existence is the anxiety that we experience as the result of being finite creations. We have a beginning, we have an end, and what we have as our human life is bounded by those two events, a beginning and an end. And he also said that to deal with that, humans exist on two planes. And I've got a diagram, so if this doesn't make sense, we're going to come back to it. First of all is the horizontal plane. That's everything that we do in life to improve or enrich our lives. It includes what we know about agriculture, technology, science, social policy, everything that we as humans do, hopefully to improve our lot. And if you look historically at how all of those things have developed, you can kind of see what he's talking about. But then he said there's a vertical line too, an up and down line. He said that's what we do to free ourselves from the limitations of our finiteness to try to grasp that which is infinite. And here he's talking about God. And we've talked about that in this class a number of times, and we've expressed our frustration with how difficult it can be to say what we think God is. Sometimes we just don't have the words. And, Paul even said that in his writings. I'm screaming out inside myself trying to put this into words, and I don't have the words. And so only the Spirit can say that for me. And so Tillich also suggested that most of what we do that constitutes religion, our religious practices, and this is including our worships, is actually on that horizontal plane, because our perceptions of God are much less than what the ultimate reality of God is. And so I take this to mean that he's saying God is much bigger than we can conceive. And I don't disagree with that. So here's the horizontal and the vertical. So on the horizontal realm, it's the finite realm. It's bounded by what we can do, say, learn, control, whether through science, technology, government policies, and so forth. And it includes religion, all of our rituals, our doctrines. He says the baggage that we carry with us sometimes because of our religion, and our worship, what we do to have a liturgy on Sunday and to practice religion as we say it. It's also the need to defend what we have. I have my stuff, you have your stuff. Don't take my stuff. Leave my stuff alone, and I'll leave your stuff alone. And so basically, this is all of human life and living is on that vertical plane. But then he says there's this, on the horizontal plane. Then he said there's a vertical plane, and he calls that the transcendent plane. That's where we find the infinite, the God of the universe. That's where we relinquish all of our finite preconceptions about God. We experience transformation. We embrace the true wisdom of God, which in the Old Testament was identified as Sophia. And he identifies this as ultimate realism, which I thought was an interesting term. And so when I think of this, I think of the great contemplative masters, the people who have developed their contemplative life, their prayer life, to such a level that, we hear the term, and sometimes we'll take it a little facetiously, I guess. They have developed to the point where they have apprehended consciousness, perfect consciousness. Well, whether you call it that or whether you call it God or enlightenment or any other term is probably not as important as the understanding itself, is that if we want to get to God, we've somehow got to get into this transformative pattern. Yes.
Wait, go back to that wisdom, Sophia word struck me, because when I was studying the last week was Trinity Sunday. And so I was studying the history of Trinity Sunday and the history of Trinity. And the early Christians thought of the Spirit as this wisdom, Sophia, because Sophia came from the philosophers at the time, Plato. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to me that Christianity actually started in that realm mm-hmm. of philosophy. If you remember, we've done a lot of studies in this group, and one of them was they were wrestling with whether they should believe some of the things that Plato did, and the early Christians said no, and then it got a little better, and so it almost became the Spirit, that third part of the Trinity mm-hmm. was wisdom, which I kind of like that concept now. Yeah. It evolved into the Spirit of God and more than just wisdom, but I'm glad that he's still saying that that's part of that transformative experience.
Well, and then the other aspect of the wisdom aspect of God in the Old Testament is the name Sophia, which has evolved into a female name, and for good reason, because wisdom was the female attribute of God. Where's Dorothy? Is Dorothy here? She's the one who always calls God she.
Yeah.
And at one point, God kind of included both the male aspect that we've sort of been stuck with since then, but also the female aspect, which was more important in Old Testament times.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now I'm going to step away from this for a second. We're just going to kind of take a quick review of everything that we've learned, a very brief review. and then come back and try to put this all together. So starting back in the very earliest writings about God, 1750 BCE, well before Moses and David and all of the other heroes of the Old Testament. And God was largely named at that time using names of the ancient nature gods, whatever land or country that they lived in, those names were used. And then we have Moses, and of course Moses goes up on the mountain and identifies the one true God, who at that time had no name that was given to the people. What did God say? Moses said, "Who are you? What's your name?" And he said, "Just know that I am." And there's a couple of thoughts about that. One of the thoughts is that the belief was that if you knew somebody's name, if you knew the name of a god in those times, it gave you power over that god. And so this is a God that says, you have not power over me, I have power over you. So as far as you're concerned, I'm just the I am. But I think that it's more than that. I think that it actually identifies this kind of transcendent God that Tillich is talking about, that we can't just put a name to and say, well, yeah, okay, now I do know who you are. Later on, the Israelites, before they came into Canaan, or as they were coming into Canaan, chose the name Yahweh. Very common description of God. Yahweh was the ancient war god of the Canaanites. Well, what was happening at that time in the Israelite march toward the Holy Land? They were attacking all the cities, and God was saying, destroy everybody in the city. And so they needed a name of a warlike God, and Yahweh seemed like a good idea at the time. We might not choose that name today. Then in 950 BC, the writings about God at that time kind of make God seem a little bit more fallible. Again, these are human writings about God. It doesn't mean that God is that. But God had begun to have some human qualities, sometimes failed, sometimes stumbled a little bit, but generally was trying to help the humans. And then in 750 BCE, we talked about Amos. Amos was the first of the Old Testament prophets who described God in this universal, just, loving, parental, purposeful, and forgiving type of an entity. And so we begin to embrace God, and God embraces us. And it's a view about God that we're probably much more comfortable with, in our day and time. And then in the post-Babylonian period, the majesty of God, the idea that God is the infallible creator who created the world out of nothing, rather than reworking the materials that were already there. Remember what, we've talked about this in Genesis, that there are actually 2 and maybe 3 accounts of the creation. And the older account of the creation, God took what was already there in the clay and made the universe out of it. But now in this period, they're saying, no, God created everything from the ground up, and that's the way that it is. Okay, now I'm going to bend your minds here a little bit. So, first century, we have the Christian insights about God. We're all very familiar with that. Just think about the writings from the book of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word goes forth from God. And so now we have God and Savior and Holy Spirit, the Trinity that Jane talked about last week. And then we're going to advance forward to about 1600 years, 1590 CE. We have the first person who's beginning to lead us to an understanding of the universal nature of the God of the cosmos. And this is somebody, Dempsey mentions it in the name in the chapter, but he doesn't really elaborate. Giordano Bruno, an Italian, one of the early astronomers. He followed Copernicus. He was about 40 years behind Copernicus. What did Copernicus say? He was the one that said the Earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is the center of the universe, and we're all rotating around that. Giordano Bruno, 1590, is about the time of one of the great inventions of humanity, the telescope. What does the telescope do? It allows us to look out into the heavens and to begin to understand how truly tiny we are, how magnificent the galaxies are. And so Bruno embraced that. He was a Dominican monk, I believe, and but he began, leaning toward the scientific, and the church didn't like that. They declared him a heretic. He was burned at the stake, and that was the end of Giordano. Then in 1960, we have space travel. We're starting to shoot
Hey, Space God.
people.
Did you write that? Space?
What's that?
Is that your language? Space
Space
Age
age
God?
God, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just saying, these are the events in human existence that are impacting how we look at God. And so we're going to outer space, and now we say, oh, it's not just this solar system. There are other galaxies out there, and perhaps this thing is even bigger than we thought it was. How many of you follow the pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope? So this is a telescope that in 2021, they shot it off on a rocket, put it almost 1 million miles out into space. And it's got all kinds of special cameras and sensors on it, so it can look at infrared light and so forth and see things that we can't perceive with the human eye. And then late last year, maybe early this year, this picture was published from the Webb telescope. Does anybody know what we're looking at here?
Solar systems?
Hmm.
Are they all solar systems?
The galaxy.
So what's that? Yes, exactly that. So when we look into space, we know that light travels at a certain rate, right? 186,000 miles per second. And so we measure the distance that light travels in terms of 1 year, or 1 light year. That's how far light can go in a single year. This is the farthest we've ever been able to look into space before. We're looking at galaxies. This is an image that was actually formed more than 13 billion years ago, okay, because the light is just now reaching Earth. It took that long. And so these are galaxies that were formed within a few 100 million years after the initial creation of the universe, whether you want to call it the Big Bang or whatever it was. This is as far distant into the expanse of the universe as we can currently see. And I think that's amazing that we can look at this and say, this is 13 billion years getting to the lens of the Webb
That's what to
telescope.
me is difficult to comprehend.
It's impossible to
This
comprehend.
is what I see. I
Yeah.
see this right now.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
you're not.
Yeah, no, you're
Well,
looking
yes,
at, we're looking at,
Billion.
we're looking at a picture that was literally made 13 billion years ago. And I mean, that's amazing. How cool is that? Talk about a transcendent God right here. But anyway, so my purpose in that is to maybe expand how big you think God is. Norman Bernauer used to ask me this all the time. How big is your God? And my God, the older I've gotten, my God just keeps getting bigger and bigger all the time. And it is hard to comprehend.
Because now they think there's also multiverses.
Well, and that's a possibility too, but I'm not going to go there today. I can only handle one universe at a time. All right, so now with all of that, let's go back to Tillich's argument. And he says that as humans, we tend to worship the symbols we create to define God rather than God himself. Okay, religion is more about the symbolism, and Tillich wanted people to actually think about their relationship with God and not their relationship so much with the symbols that define what we think God to be. He said, most religious doctrine is idolatry because it imputes the holy to an image that is made by human and finite hands. That's a lot to think about there. So what do you think?
You just gave us a lot to think
Because,
about.
am I expanding your minds here today?
Yeah.
Can I share a brief testimony?
Sure.
Most of you know that for about the last year and a half, I've been really concerned with Pam's health. The last 30 days, I've been in fear of losing, coming really, really close 2 or 3 times. And first part of this week, I just had absolutely no sense of the spirit. And that's been my ministry as an evangelist. I have focused on giving every individual an intimate knowledge and relationship of his creator God. And I don't worry about everything else. That's been enough, and God's blessed me doing that for 35 years with seeing how he works in people's lives. The other night I stood over Pam in her little hospital bed we have in our 2-room apartment. And I couldn't detect any breathing, any motion, or anything out of it. And I wanted to minister to her, and I felt so spiritually empty. and being drained over the last 30 days that I couldn't do it. And as I stood there and I watched her, finally something moved me and I found out what it was later. I laid my hand very gently on her head because if she was asleep, I didn't want to wake her up. And I tried to say, you know, can I offer a ministry of blessing to my own wife? I've done this to hundreds of people. And as I did that in a darkened room, God put his hand on my hand. And he put his other hand on my head. And he said to me, as he has many, many times in this ministry as an evangelist, John, I'm here. And I began to offer a prayer. The next 3 days, and today will be the fourth, she's become physically stronger. I've gotten her out of her bed. I've dressed her. Last night, I even took her down to the dining room to eat instead of eating in her room. I've wheeled her around. I've seen her ministry as a teacher, even though she doesn't speak very fluently. She reaches out and touches the hands of people that she's come to know in the last year or so. And I've seen that love of God reflected in their faces as they respond just to her touch. God is big like that. But I had just, 4 days ago, 3 days ago, today's the fourth, I saw God in a little 2-bedroom apartment on the corner of the 3rd floor of the home where we're living. And that only reaffirmed to me all the things and the blessings I've shared with people for the last, well, more than before I was an evangelist, but even the last 35 years.
About relationship, not about the symbols.
No, it doesn't have anything to do with doctrine, symbols, or anything. So, out of years of practice and proven testimonial results, I did want to reach out and administer to her, and I couldn't do that. But God sensed her worth as a person, and he sensed my futility. And it's almost like saying, John, because you've done this for so many years, I'm here. I mean, actually, I saw his hand on my hand, and I felt his hand on my head, and I heard his voice like you're hearing my voice. And I've heard that several times in my history. Even shared that with Stacy about her call. And he said, John, I'm here. And that not only revitalized her, but it revitalized my faith, my experiences, my memories, and my willingness to go forward. So he controls vast universes, he controls everything, but at the same time, when there's a definite need and a definite response, and it's according to the direction he wants you to go, he shows up in a little 2-bedroom apartment and actually touches you.
Let me just tag on to what Karen said, and thank you, John, for sharing that, because that your timing could have been more perfect. There was a symbol in what was going on, and the symbol was the sacrament of blessing.
Yes.
And it could have been the sacrament of the laying on of hands for administration. Okay, so that's a horizontal symbol, but it was manifested in a transcendent moment. And I think that's what Tillich, is trying to tell us.
But the reaching out is just a matter of that's how we've done it for years, and that's what I believe in everything.
Yeah.
But the vertical part of it is that, I wanted to bless my own wife, which I couldn't do, though I've blessed hundreds of other people. God has blessed them through me.
Yeah. No, thank you for that.
At the same time, God said, okay.
Yeah. No, I couldn't have asked for a better illustration. That's so awesome. Thank you. But does that make sense, Karen, what I was saying about that there was a symbol there, and the symbol, and it even tells us that in the Doctrine and Covenants about the sacraments of the church. And so anyway, so this is just back to the same slide. And as John just shared, we had, a religious rite from our church that was taking place and allowed for the moment for those two people to enter this realm where you're actually touched by the infinity of God. And I believe that's what Tillich was trying to say. Anybody else want to, we got some time here to talk about this a little bit. Anybody else want to share how this proposal has meaning?
I do think that if we, as a community of Christ, want to be a prophetic people, I think we've always tried to look towards that vertical. It's been hard. We've had a lot of growing pains in it, but we do, I think our church especially really does try to push that boundary of, we're not just defining religion. We're not just having ritual. We want to explain it. We want to understand it. And we want to open ourselves to God coming in to the finite. Yeah. And I think that's.
But how many times, again, have our rituals brought us to that moment? We talked about having mountaintop experiences or something really special happens in the midst of a worship, which is a highly human thing that we do. We worship. But it's what comes out of the worship that pushes us into that vertical realm.
Yeah, I think both are needed.
Yeah.
Well, and I can see his point that it becomes idolatry. I think when you just go through the motions, this is what we're supposed to do. And we don't look past why we're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, into why we're. But I also, okay, so I have a question. So how is mysticism a bad thing, or is it, because I kind of got that feeling from Dempsey's chapter that it wasn't necessarily a good thing.
Well, I personally feel that, again, you can worship the mysticism or you can use the practice to develop a higher sense of God's presence in your life. And I think the mysticism that he's talking about of the Old Testament was more about the show and tell,
Okay. Because I also didn't get that. I also was, when he was talking about evangelists in that last chapter, was he talking about evangelists in other church, or was he?
Let me see if I've got a slide on that. I've got one other thing here, and I think this might be, I don't know if this.
Because he kind of lost me at that one.
Yeah. So this was the dilemma that Dempsey identified in Tillich's philosophy. He said, while Tillich wrote convincingly about the vertical dimension and the urgency of cultivating it, he did not encourage many people to do so. And there's good reason, because the closer he came to describing the reality of the vertical dimension, the more vague and tentative he became. He provided a helpful description of the theological failures of our time. He's done an even more masterful job of demonstrating that most religious activity is at the human level and cannot be bridged to the infinite. But right at that crucial point, he falls short, and his towering integrity forces him to acknowledge more questions than answers about how to make the bridge to the infinite, what it means, and what it will do for us if we succeed. And I think that's where John's testimony is incredibly important, because I think that answers the problem here. I think Tillich, he ran out of words, just like we all say. I don't have the words to describe this sometimes, and I still know what happened, what it did to me internally.
And something that helps tie the two of them together is agency.
Mm-hmm.
And God created us and he gave us our agency. And as we respond to that, if we use our agency the purposeful way that he created us to be, that enables us to understand and participate more with him. Yeah. He doesn't say, you have to do this, but if you do this, you'll understand why I let you do this and what this was going to lead you to and what more you can do.
Yeah. Sometimes we're like little children. We have to try it out for ourselves. Anyway, I haven't forgotten your question, Coral. I'm going to see if I put anything in these slides about that, because I remember reading that too. I don't think he was talking about the office of evangelist. I think he was maybe talking about evangelism as a verb.
Okay, because that's what I was kind of mushy on. I was going, is he just being our evangelist?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think that.
so,
I don't think that was it. So this is Dempsey's summary. This is what he's taking from all of this. He says that prophecy, and that's my word, true prophecy, is communicating in the vertical dimension And he says it's also important that we come as a small child, full of questions and open to the answers. And John talked about, sometimes God lets us go down the wrong road a little bit to, kind of help us figure out where we're at. So Dempsey asks us the question, how does the call for community of Christ to become a prophetic people with a vision of Zion as God's kingdom prepare us for vertical living? And I would say, think of Zion as God's enduring purpose. And then he refers to this scripture from Isaiah. And many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge between the nations and shall decide for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So that's kind of the ideal. That's where we want to be. And he said, living vertically is less about our personal preparation for righteousness and salvation and hoping that a better world will result as a byproduct of those behaviors. He said it's about a world community that works with God toward peace and justice for all, and what we would call in Community of Christ the Zionic dream, where an enlightened people are working with God as the center of the universe. Okay, so what do you think about that? Those are Dempsey's final thoughts. Is the call to Zion, the call to community of Christ, is there something about that leads us to that vertical, transcendent, transformative opportunity?
It's the difference between being a believer and being being a disciple.
Yeah.
We're called not to just believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're called to live it. And when we're physically concentrating on living it, we cannot do that without touching the world and people around us. And that's how we share the gospel, is by living that gospel, that other people might see that and recognize it and say, hey, there's something there.
There's an image that keeps going on in my mind, so pardon if I can't say the artist, but you guys will all know the picture. There's a hand of God coming down, finger.
Michelangelo.
There you go. Anyway,
Sistine
and
Chapel.
I keep seeing or visualizing or thinking, okay, I'm this guy trying to get there.
Yeah.
Touching.
Trying to get that
Yeah.
finger up there to
You're
touch
trying to
the.
get there. And is my thought, I guess, am I getting my life closer to that divine?
And that's easy to understand.
Am I practicing grace and generosity, wisdom and creation? Am I doing all of those things?
Yeah.
And I can't tell somebody else to do them unless I can do them myself, kind of a thing.
And that's
Sorry, that's
easier,
just an image that I've had.
easier to understand. Those of your parents, think of how many times have you put your finger down and let your child reach up and touch that finger for insurance, for comfort, for physical assistance. And so that symbolism of God's finger coming down and yours going up is.
How many times does a child grab your finger to pull themselves up, to stand up? Yeah, so I think, I think about all the religions in the world and all the different flavors of Christianity, and if we worship our religion, it only accentuates the differences between us. It will never bring us together. But when we look for the one who is the source and the author of all of that, then we can find our commonality as the human creation of a God who's so magnificent that he left a 13 billion-year-old picture out there for us to find.
Yeah. Well, I mean, recently I preached on, I talked about Gnosticism, about sacramentality, and how we live in a physical universe, but physical things, acts that are physical are beyond physical too. So the sacraments are physical and they're beyond physical. They point to something beyond. And then you get into, I think with the Gnostic dualism, then you get into this zero-sum game where it's like physical versus spiritual. Which one will win? It's like, why can't you have both? Why can't you have both? Now, God, if you believe in the divinity of Jesus, Christ is God, then Jesus was in some ways a graven image, a walking graven image. And you should say, well, don't worship Jesus. He's just an aspect of God. But you can still, you should. I mean, you can kiss Jesus on the forehead, but also know that God is more powerful than 1 billion nuclear bombs. And you can't kiss a nuclear explosion on the forehead.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Well, it does. And
I wouldn't recommend it.
well, there was a book I think Roy Cheville wrote back in the 1950s called God's Spiritual Universe. And I think that's what he was talking about is we live in the physical realm. We can't change that. We live in the physical universe, but how do we touch the spiritual universe that we sometimes feel all around us?
Yeah, we live in the horizontal. I mean, we can't do anything about that. We do need the horizontal to keep going in our lives, but every once in a while we get to have that transformation, like what you were saying about communion. I really, in your sermon, I appreciated that. I mean, you have to recognize communion as both, because, I mean, I don't know if they still believe it, but the Catholics always taught that it was the literal, body of Christ. And I never could understand that until you taught me, okay, we've transformed that now to say it can be both. It's okay to say, Jesus was saying to us, do this in remembrance of me. So it's physical. I like remembering the humanity of Christ and the divinity of Christ.
That was actually one of the things that Giordano Bruno got executed for was he did not believe in the transubstantiation of the communion wafer into the body
I was
of
bad back
Christ.
then.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, we're having communion today.
I know.
So what aspect, feeling inside me, heart, whatever, what is going to transpire as I reach forth
Right,
today?
right.
What's there? What's the meaning for you? Okay. Only I can talk about the meaning to me.
Look up, there's about 3 passages of scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants that talk about the sacraments of the church and why they've been given. Maybe we ought to revisit those sometime as part of the communion service.
Well, for me, it's getting to recenter myself. Okay, I've screwed up again this month. So I will try and do better this month and just, try to and focus on what it means.
In all of the sacraments of the church are a combination of the physical and the spiritual. If you stop and look at it, it's a chance where the two come together and it gives you a greater meaning and a greater understanding of what's just a physical aspect. It's a renewing of a covenant. It's not just eating bread and drinking blood. It's not just the symbolism of doing that with Christ's body and Christ's blood. It's the fact that you're physically being fed. He's saying, come, I have something for you. And so by renewing that and recognize that as a physical thing we do, it opens the door that he can give us a little more of spiritual awareness. God is not up there. God is down here. God is really right in here. And it's the physical things that we do. And again, by living the gospel, that enable us to be more aware of that. You know, that Paul, in every blessing that you've ever given. You know, and it's not mysticism, it's nothing, it's not us doing it, it's God saying, okay, you've responded to my call, I'm going to do this. And I don't know how many times I've given blessings and prepared long time for them and find out that the blessing is completely different than what I've prepared for, because it was God speaking to them. And most of my ministry, as I've shared from the pulpit several times, as God has spoken to this congregation, is first person. But you know, that's the promise he made to me, and I've shared this with you, and I've heard him share it with Stacy from my own mouth. That, you know, if you continue to love my children, my people, as I love my people, I will put my words in your mouth and I will lead you to those things that you need to know. Now, for me, that was a necessity because I didn't know very much anyway. I resisted my first call to the priesthood because I was at Naval Academy preparing to be a professional warrior, and Roy Cheville comes along and wants me to be a teacher. And I said, how can I reconcile the two of those? Later on, when Bob Billings brought it to me in my garden in Pennsylvania, I found myself falling on my face and saying yes, and I'd gotten away from the church, and I'd forgotten all the things that I knew, the go ye and teach slides and everything that I grew up here memorizing and just being able to quote on a minute's notice as a child through a middle teenager. I'd forgotten all that, but as I lay in the dirt and said, God, how can I do this? I don't remember any of that stuff. And he spoke to me again. And for the first time, just like I'm talking to you, he said, John, if you continue to love my people as I love my people, I will put my words in your mouth and I will lead you to those things that you need to know. And he's never broken that promise. My first time as a pastor, he told me that again. My ordination to the office of evangelist, he told me that again. And he's never broken that promise. It's not, and you know, everybody thinks having a doctorate's important, and I've never really used mine other than to get more stuff, to learn more stuff. But it's not those things and I didn't know those things, but God has led me for 35 years into different people's lives and situations I had no knowledge, understanding, or anything about. But because I was willing to live what Jesus had taught us, that enabled God to help me so he could bless these people in a way that they might understand. He could have blessed them without me, but the fact that it came through me might have helped them understand it a little bit more. So there's always, you know, there's really not any division between physical and spiritual. It's as we live our physical and the spiritual in a spiritual way, they come together for eventually spiritual and physical are the same thing. And that's what God created us to be.
Okay, one more thing, just
Yeah.
1 minute. I know we're done, but John, one of the things your testimony reminded me of is that power of touch. You were saying to us that you felt helpless, but when you reached out and touched your wife was when you opened yourself back up again to that spirit, and then God flooded into you to say, here's what you need to say, John.
I think so.
I honestly think that the power of touch is a part of our sacraments. I mean, you think about most of our sacraments have the power of touch in them. You know, when we bless the children, we ordain, when we administer to the sick, there is a powerful something in our hands. And I've had some experience outside of our religion with this too. There's something about touching people that I think it connects us first, and then it opens us. It opened you to that spirit. And I really think we need to explore that some more.
That's
And
very
it's
true.
important in communion. I used to love to serve communion. I still do, but I physically can't do it anymore. But as I would do it, I'd always reach out and put my hand on the shoulder as I extended
Yeah,
the
I
plate.
noticed you did that.
And I do it when people serve me. Sometimes I'll reach up and touch their hand.
Yeah,
And it's that touch
Yeah,
it enables that spiritual and physical come
Yeah.
together.
That's the part that I like the most about teaching in the world of anesthesia, because for years, as I would put patients to sleep, I had to be up at the head, managing things. And then when I came to teach, the student does all of that.
Yeah.
And I could stand next to the patient and hold their hand as they went off to sleep.
Yeah.
And most people, when they wake back up again, would tell you they don't remember much about the operating room, but I remember you held my hand
Oh,
as I went to sleep. I mean, that's just, to me, was the most comforting thing I could do,
oh my goodness. That's
for
powerful.
somebody who was
I would
getting ready
like
to
that
have surgery.
completely
Me
to have
too.
to-
And it works on the street with broken bodies, all my years on the street doing that stuff.
Yeah.
And touch is very important,
Yeah,
and if you notice the Christ always touched, he always reached out and he touched somebody's shoulder, or he took somebody's hand, or, like the woman in the square when he helped her up and said, go. But he lifted her to her feet first.
All right, next week,
All right.
Jane will be starting our new book,
we
Beyond
go.
Belief.
there we go.
We have 2 more copies that came in this week. Maybe everybody's got a copy by now, but if you don't, feel free to take one. And I'll get that sent out so you can read the Gospel of Thomas this week.
I can't remember there's an intro. What did we decide I was gonna do? Oh, there's just chapter 1, okay.
Yeah. I looked at it this morning, because I thought we were
Okay,
starting.
I started reading it and then I thought,
And it
is
was
there?
like, darn, I waited too long to read it again.
You got time.
I know.
Chapter 1 then, chapter 1. All right,
Okay, the last thing is, my God is so big, so
I know, I
strong,
thought of that
so mighty,
something.
there's nothing that he cannot do.
Ron's always got a camp off.
Yeah.
I'm taking this a month.
Okay, I did.